everyone, welcome to Midcast. I'm your host, Manar Adli. This is an interview series featuring dissenting voices the mainstream media would rather silence. Today, I'm joined by independent journalist, writer, and researcher Vanessa Beeley, who's based in Damascus, Syria. She's been covering the conflict in Syria for many independent media outlets, including Mint Press News. And today, she's here to join me to discuss the recent escalation between Washington and Syria. Recently, the Joe Biden administration, within its first 3 months within office, dropped 1.75 tons of bombs on a town on the border of Syria and Iraq, killing 22 people amid a global pandemic when the majority of Americans are still waiting on their stimulus checks. So we're here to discuss this with Vanessa. She's on the ground. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining us today.
Hi, it's really good to be back on.
It's good to see you. Tell us about the latest escalation between the United States and Syria in the last couple of weeks.
Well, I mean, basically, this started as far back as New Year's Eve, when we saw an uptick in ISIS attacks on Syrian Arab army positions, on arterial roads, on oil depots, fuel depots, etc. Just leading up to Joe Biden's inauguration. And then, of course, 36 days into after his inauguration, we saw the violation of international law and the bombing of Syrian territory right on the border, as you said, with Iraq in an area called Al-Bukamal. Al-Bukamal is a major trade crossing, let's say, between Iraq and Syria, and it's one of the few crossings that is not under control of Turkey or of the US or of the Syrian Democratic Forces or the Kurdish separatists. And so therefore, this was a clear message from Joe Biden to the Syrian administration in Damascus and to its allies inside Syria, that it was not going to allow the continuation of trade across this border. It was going to shut down every aspect of trade for the Syrian government, on the basis, of course, on the pretext of self-defense, on the basis of an attack previously on one of the American occupation bases inside Iraq, but 500 kilometers away from where Biden actually launched his missiles and killed, this is an important point to make, one of the members of the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Forces, that are described as an Iranian militia, but of course, actually they are a militia that was established to fight ISIS. Of course, America is claiming to fight ISIS inside Syria and Iraq. And the PMU comprises all the minority communities from inside Iraq. So although it receives some help from Iran, it effectively works very closely with the Iraqi government, with the Iraqi army. It's very much has a similar role to Hezbollah in that it's integrated into Iraqi society, and it has been responsible for the defeat of ISIS in many of the battles in Iraq.
And so talking about this pretext that was used, you mentioned that, we heard it all over the news, right? It was the United States targeting Iranian-backed militias. I mean, we hear this often so much in the coverage of Syria. It's like, why is the United States in Syria targeting Iranian militias? Can you explain that to us?
No, it's extraordinary. I mean, what was extraordinary is immediately after this attack, how all the mainstream media basically ran with the Pentagon tagline, which was that this was in retaliation for the attack, which, by the way, has not been claimed by any of the Iranian militia. So in my view, there is a very strong chance that these are Israeli false flags designed to enable the Biden administration to carry out this unlawful aggression against Syria on the basis that it's attacking Iranian militia that is attacking US bases. US bases, of course, that Iraqi parliament has voted to leave, to vacate Iraq. So very rapidly, of course, Biden's troops inside Iraq are becoming vulnerable assets rather than, as he describes them, defensive troops inside Iraq. The anti-Iran tagline is part of the ramping up of aggression again, or rather the threat of aggression against Iran. And of course, this is being led by Israel. Israel is furious that Biden is returning to the nuclear deal that Obama established and Trump basically backed out of, which was to the huge pleasure of Israel. So, of course, we're going to see now Israel putting pressure on Biden to effectively turn back on the aggression against Iran. That's why I think there's a very strong possibility that Israel is orchestrating the attacks on the US bases in order to prevent Biden coming to the table to talk with Iran. It's also an indication of Biden's weakness. You know, the fact that he's caved into the neoconservative influences inside Washington at his first, within 40 days of his presidency, basically. So it's a clear indication to Iran that Biden is a weak negotiating partner, that he's going to be pressured both by Israel and by the neoconservative elements inside his own administration and bipartisan neoconservative elements, right? These days, I see so little difference between Republican, Democrat. We've just seen the continuation of the roadmap that was established under kind of Clinton, Bush, Obama, carried on through Trump. Trump was very much the economic battering ram inside Syria, effectively to surround Syria on all sides and to bring its knees economically before Biden came in, and is effectively increasing the US military footprint in Syria.
And talking about this roadmap, this plan that the United States and the neocons and the neoliberals, whether Republican or Democrat, have for Syria. I know that things change a little bit during the Trump administration, but where do you see that plan headed towards under the Biden administration?
Well, I kind of have a theory about the Trump administration. If we go back to when Trump was elected, it was just after Russia actually intervened and the military tide started to turn in favor of the Syrian government and its allies. So I tend to also see that all US elections, as they are in the UK, are pretty much orchestrated and that the results are known very much in advance. And I think at that point, they realized that were Clinton to come in, she wouldn't have a clear military view, right? Because Russia had taken everyone by surprise by intervening in the way it did. And I think at that point, it was allowed for Trump to come in because Trump, as I said, effectively, although people always say he didn't start any wars, but actually in Syria, he probably caused greater damage than the Obama administration, strange though that may seem. But economically, and not only economically, I mean, he ramped up the sadistic economic sanctions that only ever target the people of any prey nation. They never target what the US administration is telling you they're targeting. The same in Iraq, the same in Yemen, the same in Syria, in Venezuela, in Russia, in Iran, etc.
Well, the claim is, like you said, it's a non-violent approach when really it's extremely sadistic and very.
It actually kills more people, yes, I believe, than a military war. The hundreds of thousands of children that died in Iraq. I mean, that, and they dare to call that non-lethal. It's one of the cruelest forms of collective punishment for a people of a nation that is being targeted by the US. It's very difficult to describe the effects of sanctions. I mean, I'm living here, I'm seeing them on a daily basis. And under Trump, the sanctions with the Caesar law, which was brought in 2019, I lose track a bit, of course, doubled down on the devastation of the previous sanctions. Sanctions here, of course, have been in effect since around 1979. And it's worth pointing out that one of the reasons that sanctions were imposed, I think, in the early 2000s, was because the US claimed that Assad was harboring the PKK, which then, of course, was known as a terrorist organization. Now it's known as the SDF, and it's
are we arming
ally.
those guys? Are we arming them?
Of course we are.
Are we arming them now?
Yeah, you're arming them and you're giving them Syrian territory. I mean, it's an ongoing pattern, right? We see it time and time again when the US's enemy becomes its best friend when it serves a purpose, right? And that's exactly what's happening now. And so under Trump, we saw this increase of economic pressure, doubling down on the multi-spectrum war. We also saw the burning of crops, which I wrote about for Mint Press. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
The burning of crops, the stealing of the oil, the occupation of the oil fields, which is not because America needs the oil. It's basically to prevent the Syrian people from having the oil and to provide revenue for their proxies. In this case, both ISIS and the SDF. 1 second.
Oh, that's okay, Vanessa.
I apologize. And so then, we move on to Biden, and then we're almost back to what I call the Obama-Clinton roadmap, which is the toppling of the Syrian government, the cutting back of Iranian influence. I mean, this is the terrifying thing for Israel. It threatens its supremacy and its security in the region. Because were, for example, Iran to achieve road access through Iraq, through Syria, and down to Palestine, of course, this is the greatest fear for Israel, that Iran achieves this kind of access to its borders, right? We've seen throughout the 10-year war, these kind of negotiations going on that Iran has to pull back from the border with the actual occupied territories of Syria in the Golan territories that Israel is occupying and annexing. And so what I see as this talk of aggression against, and of course, in the Israeli language, it's always preemptive, self-defensive aggression, right? I mean, we hear this time and time again. Oh, we're going to be aggressive to prevent them being aggressive against us, right? I mean, we have it all the time. They are constantly, and in fact, the Israeli attacks have increased since Biden was elected. The Israeli attacks on Syrian territory have increased. And again, the pretext is always we're attacking Iranian militia. I mean, this is complete violation of international law. The Iranian militia as such, or the official Iranian military, are here at the invitation of the Syrian government, the internationally recognized Syrian government that is defending itself against a huge number of hostile states that are invading its country with various proxy extremist groups that Israel is supporting with arms, with finances, with hospital treatment, medical treatment, etc. So we're back on the roadmap of subjugating Syria, of driving out, as they perceive it, the Iranian influence and expansionism, and toppling the Syrian government. Of course, now the Biden administration is kind of quoting it in this honeyed language. They're saying, well, yeah, we'll consider lifting the sanctions, but only if you effectively surrender completely, and release all the Islamist prisoners. I mean, there was a paper written very early on in the Biden administration, and actually Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria, has commented very acerbically about this. And he's basically said what this is effectively is a demand for the Syrian government to surrender, and then they will lift the sanctions, which again demonstrates exactly what sanctions are designed to do.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you talk about, you talked about a lot of things, but I'm
sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. That was a really great explanation of the conflict in Syria. But I think it's really important that you highlight Israel's role in the conflict, because whenever we're, consuming mainstream media news or even some independent media outlets, they don't totally cover Israel's role in the conflict. And the truth is, just the way you described it, is that the war in Syria benefits really Israel. At the end of the day, Israel is the main beneficiary of this war in Syria. And talk to me about the latest attacks on Syrian soil by Israel. You mentioned a couple that happened recently.
Yeah, I mean, actually, again, since New Year's Eve, we've seen a number of Israeli attacks. And the one that was towards the end of February that I actually went and visited the area that came under attack, which was in to the west of Hama city, to the northwest of Damascus, just so people realize where it is. And they're actually a family of 9. Their house was hit by one of the Israeli missiles. 5 members of the family were killed and 4 were grievously injured. The house itself was destroyed and a number of neighbors were badly injured in the attack, and their shops, their houses were destroyed. This was a very tightly packed suburb of Hama. I mean, any rocket that hit there would have done terrible damage. And of course, none of this was even mentioned in Western media. I mean, I think the loss of life was just about touched on after a few days, when, the Syrian media had reported on it. But of course, there is never any condemnation of Israel for carrying out, except by Russia. There is never any international condemnation of the Israeli attacks, because Israel always puts it under the pretext that we are under threat from the Iranian militia inside Syria, and therefore we have the right to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. I mean, where have we heard that before? But I think, coming back to your point about this war benefits Israel, and yes, of course it does. I mean, even the US occupation of the territory to the east of the Euphrates, of course, this was part of the original Yinon plan for Israel to take the territory to the east of the Euphrates, right? And so therefore we have to see that the SDF, the Kurdish separatists, are being used as a settler instrument for both the US and for Israel. Israel supports the Kurdish separatists, right? I mean, right. It's clearly, it supported them already in Iraq, but it also supports them in Syria. And of course, what we're seeing very much is a repeat of what happened in Iraq, in the sense that the Kurds are being used to occupy the oil-rich regions. It is then being suggested that that area is partitioned and becomes autonomous. And of course, then it will be supported by the US and by Israel. It will be free from sanctions. This is another really important point to make about sanctions. While the sanctions apply to the Syrian people living under the protection of the Syrian state, it doesn't apply to US proxies. Right, and that includes Al-Qaeda and all manner of affiliates. It applies to ISIS.
So they're not sanctioned. They're not sanctioned.
Oh no, they're given every single benefit, aid, equipment, medical aid, food, revenue that they need. Right. I mean, to give you an indication, the SDF are occupying the oil fields. They're receiving the majority of the revenue from that, but they also receive revenue from stolen wheat and barley, cotton, agricultural equipment, agricultural feedstuff. So all of this is depriving the Syrian people while giving revenue to the SDF. But swap over from the northeast to the northwest, and then the oil, processing is being done by Al-Qaeda. They've actually established a petroleum company called Watad. There are actually now 2 competing for the monopoly with each other, but both affiliated to Al-Qaeda.
So sophisticated. And
yeah, it is. They have cryptocurrency. Seriously. I mean, they have Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. We just have inflation. Seriously. I mean, people don't realize that the actual insanity of this entire construct, and how it's being narrated to you by the US.
Right. And I was actually going to ask you next, what is happening to Syria's oil right now? Can we go there?
Yeah. So basically, the oil that's being stolen in the northeast by the US proxy, the Kurdish separatists, is then being processed by Al-Qaeda in the northwest. and is bringing them in a huge amount of revenue when they resell that to Turkey, right? And in the same way,
insanity. If I want a piece of that pie, I just have to go through Bitcoin, right? Get my Bitcoin wallet ready.
Yeah. And the US itself is, I think it was just yesterday that I saw that the US itself was using its military trucks to steal wheat and grain and to take it away from Syria and down towards the Al Tanf base, American occupation base on the border with Jordan and Iraq. So all the time there are convoys, American convoys, taking oil, taking wheat, taking grain out of Syria in order to effectively bring the state to its knees. You know, it hasn't succeeded in defeating Syria militarily. So now, of course, we're seeing a very familiar pattern. Now it will use the multi-spectrum tactics. It will use, for example, now the US is doubling the ISIS camp in the Northeast, funding by the UK, of course, one of the main partners in the US coalition in the destruction of Syria. So now they've decided they're going to expand the ISIS camp, holding camp in Hasaka in the Northeast. That will mean that they will have 10,000, more or less, ISIS terrorists under their control in a camp, which will be guarded by the SDF. Of course, the SDF benefit from this because they take bribes from ISIS. So there's a whole kind of mafia operation going on at this level also, which provides revenue. We know already that the US is training and recruiting and arming and equipping ISIS in Al Tanf. So the fact that they're establishing and expanding the ISIS camp in the Northeast to 10,000 terrorists, we know that they have been ferrying those terrorists from the various US camps around Hasaka into the desert, close to Deir ez-Zor. From there, those terrorists are carrying out attacks against the Syrian Arab Army. We know that Americans have been ferrying ISIS into Iraq to retrain them, re-equip them, to turn them into a kind of super ISIS and then bring them back into Syria. So the increase in the camp is clearly a way of blackmailing Russia and Damascus. It's a way of threatening them because clearly at any moment there can be a breakout from the camp. Right? And we know that the US is ferrying those terrorists around anyway to carry out isolated attacks. For example, in the last few days, we've had new ISIS attacks to the east of Salamiyah. Now that area had been completely cleaned of ISIS terrorists. Now they're back. Where have they come from? You know, they haven't just suddenly organically appeared out of nowhere. How many, years ago was it that Trump was claiming they'd completely defeated ISIS? ISIS is just the boogeyman.
Absolutely.
ISIS it's just the reason for the US to be here, just as Al-Qaeda was in various other places.
Exactly. And we've covered this in the past, for
Yeah.
years, for pretty much a decade. The war on terror is basically just fueling more terrorism. It's not actually to fight terrorism. It's just it uses an excuse to get into.
Well, let's see how much terror has grown exponentially since the war on terror began.
It has grown a lot, absolutely. We've covered it in like every country from Yemen to Iraq to Sudan to Somalia. I mean, these.
Well, actually,
expanded.
In Yemen, there we heard in the last 2 days that Turkey now is involving itself in the war against Yemen, and it is threatening to take terrorists from inside Syria and to transport. Of course, this was already happening, actually. ISIS terrorists were getting taken from Syria to Yemen even before, I think, maybe under Obama, that started. But now Turkey is talking about sending its Al-Qaeda affiliates from Syria, as it has done in Libya, of course, and in Azerbaijan, and sending them to Yemen. And actually coming back to that, while Israel is probably one of the biggest threats, Turkey is also under Erdogan. Because under Erdogan, you have a very similar expansionist lunatic in charge of the government with neo-Ottoman pretensions. And I think it was Kevork Almassian who did a really good episode recently, and he made a lot of sense. He said the difference between Israel and Turkey is Israel occupies by force, which can never stand the test of time because there will always be pushback. But Turkey is cleverer. Turkey uses its Muslim Brotherhood roots, if you like, to occupy through incentivization, basically. I mean, that's why in Idlib they have cryptocurrency, they have electricity 24/7, they have Bitcoin, they have, I mean, literally, it's a thriving industry in Idlib because Turkey is making it possible to exist, right? And so that's how Turkey works, and it's a much more actually insidious way of occupying and annexing territory, because actually the people in that territory, predominantly Muslim Brotherhood extremists, whether they are Syrian or foreigners, believe that life is better under Turkish rule. You can see that in the demonstrations in Idlib, you know, calling for Turkey to come in, calling for Turkey to occupy them. So yeah, there's a huge difference between Turkey and Israel, and in some ways that makes Turkey as big a threat, if not a greater threat, than Israel in some ways.
Well, and now Syria is, from what I understand, is in the rebuilding stage in many places across Syria. Yeah. We've talked about this before, and based on everything you just described and explained, is that still the case?
Yeah, it is. I mean, actually, you know, Syria is an extraordinary country. I mean, you know this from Palestine, and we see it in Yemen. We see it actually in all these countries that are part of the resistance bloc, that have for years suffered under sanctions, under the threat of military campaigns against them on some spurious pretext, whether it's weapons of mass destruction or the chemical attacks in Syria or the Benghazi rape stories or the incubator babies. I can go on and on, right? But basically all these countries have the kind of sword of Damocles over their head all the time. They live with it. And they are extraordinarily resourceful. I mean, take, for example, the air defense here. The Syrian air defense is archaic, but there are Syrian engineers who work all week, and then at weekends they go and modify the air defense to make it more effective. And this is very much what has enabled Syria to survive. It's the fabric of this society, the determination to maintain its secular way of life, and to not be subsumed by some kind of Islamist, extremist, backward thinking ruling force, which of course will be backed by all of the predator nations that are circling around it. You know, and the rebuilding is still going on, but it's very much a trickle process because, of course, under the Caesar sanctions, it's virtually impossible for example, the medical sector. I had a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Health last week. They can't get equipment. You know, many of their cancer wards are no longer functioning properly because they can't get replacement equipment for machinery, which is already old. And yeah, the rebuilding and restoration is going on, but it's going on very, very slowly.
Right. I suppose sanctions would affect that so much based on what you're telling me.
Yeah, totally.
And talk to me about, I want to wrap up here very soon, but I want to know about the countries that are helping Syria. I know that Venezuela has stepped in, Iran has stepped in, rebuilding Syria. I mean, what is the dynamics here in looking for those who are actually in support of Syria rebuilding and and continuing to be a sovereign nation?
Well, actually, I mean, there are a number of countries like Czechoslovakia, for example, and South Africa, who never left their embassies here, you know, and they stayed throughout the war. And actually, they've been quietly very supportive from various trade perspectives, etc. South Africa, for example, now the ambassador here is working very hard to persuade people in South Africa that it's safe to invest in Syria, etc., and to try and build those trade bridges. Iran, of course, is doing whatever it can with providing oil. The same from Russia. what Russia has done on a humanitarian basis, on a military basis, is extraordinary. I'm not saying that Russia is not benefiting from this, of course. I mean, under Putin now, Russia has achieved what the Soviet Union never achieved, which is, to a degree, almost supremacy in the Middle East. I mean, Russia now has become the pivotal power here, more so than America.
Okay.
And I that's a big achievement for Russia. So let's not rule out the fact that they are receiving benefits from what is going on inside Syria, as is everyone, and that is one of the big complexities and one of the big problems here also. China is another one who's obviously helped through vetoes at the UN, the same as Russia. And that's another point. Russia has been probably the strongest ally at the UN and a very important ally for Syria at the UN, pushing back against the chemical weapon claims, etc. And who have I covered? Hezbollah, of course, who again have committed themselves to the military campaign here, without any real benefit for Hezbollah, other than, of course, the security of Syria on the border with Lebanon, and the protection of an ally of Palestine. So all these countries are doing what they can, but of course, they are all also under sanctions themselves. Right. And they are trying to, for example, to create economic circumnavigation of the sanctions through creating currencies, through creating economic trade lines, etc., that can circumnavigate the dollar and try and avoid the sanctions. But it's tough.
Absolutely. I mean, to rebuild a country that has been ravaged and attacked from every corner of the world is going to take some time. I mean, you just look at Gaza. This tiny strip of land has been completely just brought down to rubble. And how much time is that going to take to rebuild? Or countries like Sudan or Yemen, it's just going to take so much time and effort. But Vanessa, I appreciate you being here with us today. I always learn so much from you, and I really appreciate you being on the ground in Syria to share these facts with our audiences, because our mainstream corporate media has failed us so miserably on really educating the public about what truly is happening in Syria. And of course, we know why. It's because they're promoting the war there. So thank you for joining Mintcast.
Thank you so much for having me back on. And anytime you want to talk through events here, I think they're going to be moving forward pretty rapidly now.
Absolutely. We will definitely have you on again. So thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.